Hi, I'm Stephen Mann, PhD candidate and affiliate of the Humanizing Machine Intelligence Project. And with me today, Kate Vredenburgh, postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University. We're going to be talking about algorithmic decision making and the right to explanation. But first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in philosophy and how you got into the ethics of artificial intelligence?
So my main interests in philosophy are in philosophy of science and political philosophy, and they really dovetail very nicely in the kind of, AI ethics sphere. So I'm interested in questions in philosophy of science, such as, what is the world like, such that we can use scientific methodologies to know about it. In particular, I think about what are explanations and why are they valuable, what's the kind of special significance that they have, such that we as scientists and as sort of ordinary creatures particularly value them. I'm also interested in some questions in political philosophy. So political philosophy very broadly thinks about, how we ought to live together in the political domain, and questions from philosophy of science and political philosophy sometimes intersect. So you might, for example, have a particular policy that you want to enact, but you'll want to know, okay, what sort of things do I need to know about the world such that this is a good or bad policy to enact? And these are precisely the sort of questions that I'm interested in thinking about. So in the case of AI, what are the kind of value of these models that we come up with? Do they provide us with explanations? If not, is that a good or bad thing? And then what are the conditions under which we can permissibly use many of these models in the political sphere? So for example, if we think, hey, we've got a pretty good model to figure out whether or not someone is well qualified for a loan, can we go ahead and use that? Or does the model have some properties such that we might need to kind of have a second think? Yeah.
So companies and governments are increasingly using these kinds of models to make decisions, and decisions that impact individual people. You've recently argued that when people are impacted by these decisions, they have a right to explanation. What kind of thing is a right to explanation? It sounds obvious. Is it as obvious as it sounds?
It's not as obvious as it sounds, although the motivation for it, I think, is very easy to get into. So an example that I like to use to get people thinking about this is Franz Kafka's The Trial. So The Trial, if you haven't read it, the setup is Joseph K., the main character, wakes up one morning. He looks to his left, there are two policemen standing over him, and they say, "You're under arrest." And he's like, "Oh gosh, what have I done?" And they say, "Well, we don't actually know. No one has told us. We've just been sent to arrest you, but our boss will be here any minute. She'll be able to tell you." Their boss comes, he's ushered into his own living room a few hours later, and she says, "You need to report to the court the next week." And he says, "Okay, well, what for? What have I done such that I've been arrested?" And she says, "Well, I don't actually know that, but, go to court, they'll sort you out." And Joseph K., the main character, actually goes through this entire process, never being given an explanation of why he's been treated as he's been treated, and is, in the end, kind of tragically executed. And I think, Kafka and these early 20th century critiques of bureaucracy were alive to something that is now just becoming an increasing topic of political interest with algorithms. So these bureaucracies can be opaque to the people subject to them in ways that make them unfair. So, in the case of Joseph K., he neither knows the rules of his society. So what are the rules for, under which people are arrested, tried for certain crimes, et cetera, by which punishment is determined, nor does he know how these rules are being, applied in his particular case. So, okay, say the rule is, we ought to execute anyone who's committed treason. Well, he doesn't know, first of all, he doesn't unfortunately know what the rule is, but say even if he knew the rule, he wouldn't know if it was being applied kind of for the right reasons in his case or not. And so because of that, Joseph K. can't do any of the things that would have made this process fair, contributed toward it being fair. He can't go out on the street and protest and say, "Hey, I and my fellow citizens disagree with these deeply unfair rules," because no one knows what they are. He can't, in his particular case, say, contest the decision and say, "Hey, there was some sort of mistake in this trial. You've charged me with treason, but the evidence you've provided is actually false," say. And so because of that, this opaque decision making by this bureaucracy is deeply unfair. And you see many similar complaints now leveraged against the use of algorithms in the public sphere. So because either they're protected by trade secrecy law, or because they're just so enormously complicated that it's difficult for even an expert to understand how, the inputs to the algorithm are connected to the outputs, we can't do things like say, hey, the rules by which this algorithm is determining decisions are not ones that we should agree to, or hey, I think this was mistaken in my particular case. So it's these sort of considerations about what it's required for people to be able to navigate these big systems fairly that kind of give rise to this right to explanation.
So it's a question of fairness.
Yeah.
That makes it sound like quite a fundamental right.
Yeah.
How fundamental is it, in your opinion, compared to other kinds of rights?
It's a great question. So in a way, I think it's a deeply kind of fundamental and overlooked right. So it's a right that we ought to think alongside, say, my right to freedom of movement, so to move wherever I want within my own country. We should enshrine this as one of our basic sort of rights. But that being said, the right sort of, in a way you might think about rights in a way that there's sort of just things that we have independently of the contingent circumstances we find ourselves in. So you might think of a kind of, right to bodily integrity as, well, it doesn't really matter, it's nothing about the external environment or my circumstances that give rise to this kind of right. It's just one that I have, that I can, claim against other people, give rise to certain duties in them. By contrast, the right to explanation really arises in certain kinds of institutions. So there are institutions with, for example, hierarchies. So some people are exercising power and making decisions about other people. In the case of the trial, there was this criminal justice system that had some power over Joseph K. and was making decisions, and so needs to justify those decisions to him. But there are also institutions in which, say, knowledge is distributed in a certain way. So the decision maker knows what the rules are and how he or she is applying them in a particular case, but Joseph K. himself doesn't know. And I think these are the sort of features of institutions that give rise to this requirement of explanation, because in order for individuals to have a kind of check on this power hierarchy and to be able to get some of the knowledge that the decision maker has in order to provide those sort of checks, she needs to be provided, or he needs to be provided, with explanations. Yeah.
And I guess these kinds of institutions and the interactions between institutions and individuals are increasing as more and more actors are using these algorithms. I mean, could you give us a few more examples of algorithmic modeling being used today to make decisions that impact individuals?
Yeah, it's incredibly common. So you find it, in healthcare, in the judicial system, in the welfare system, in the financial system. So just a few examples. So in 2009 in Washington, D.C., the school system introduced a model in order to judge whether a teacher was a kind of high-performing teacher or a low-performing teacher. So it was developed by a private company, and this public school system had the well-intentioned thought, our students are not performing particularly well, so what we ought to do is use this model to identify the teachers that are performing very poorly, fire them, and then replace them with, better performing teachers. But because this was a model, a kind of proprietary model developed by a private company, the private company didn't need to share the details of the models with the school system. So the school system was using this model in order to fire teachers, but because they didn't have access to any of the details of this model, couldn't explain to the teachers why they had been fired. All they could say was, well, according to this model, you're underperforming compared with what we should expect from you and compared to your peers, so you've been fired. Another example is, again, in the US, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. This example comes from Virginia Eubanks's book, Automating Inequality. So she describes how a child services department is using a model to rank different cases that come in as, say, high risk or low risk. So you've got an incoming case of a child and you want to know, okay, is this a case that's, say, high risk for neglect or abuse or low risk, and use that to inform decision making. Again, because this model was both complicated and proprietary, you got people in this government agency that were using this model actually got quite good and kind of comically quite good at foreseeing how the model would rank these incoming cases, but they themselves, because they didn't know the details of the model and because it was also quite complex, didn't understand why the model was ranking cases as it did. So they got into this situation, as, say, a person who needs to make a decision about a particular case of child welfare, where you've got your own expert judgment on the basis of working this job for a number of years. You've got the output of this model that tells you this number that you don't really understand how it was generated. Then you've got to somehow, take these two pieces of information and decide which one should I go with in cases of divergence. So I think, the cases of AI are particularly fascinating and kind of maybe even more worrying, because often it's not just, as in the case of, say, the trial, that, okay, we've got this complicated bureaucracy that maybe the bureaucrats understand, but the citizens don't. In the case of AI, it's often, hey, even the bureaucrats, even the decision makers, maybe even those kind of developing the models don't understand them as deeply as we might want them to.
And I suppose one of the other issues is, without an explanation, without a reason for why that decision has been made, as to say why you were fired, you have no understanding of how to change your behavior, to improve your behavior in some sense, in order not to have that decision made about you again.
Yeah, exactly. So I think a really important and powerful thing to recognize is exactly this, the kind of deep instrumental value of explanations for a number of things that individuals need to do in order for these systems to be fair. So one thing that, the example of Joseph K. brings out is individuals need to be able to contest decisions in order for those decisions to be fair, and explanations enable that. But you brought out another really important thing is, if I set up some system of rules, say, to allow individuals to compete for some scarce benefit, well, it had better be that everyone is equally well placed to compete, otherwise it's not a fair system. So say you and I are, I set up a little competition where there's a cake, and we need to show up at some place in an appointed date and time and have like a philosophy off, and whoever wins our philosophy throwdown gets this whole cake. But I just don't tell you where it is. Maybe you happen to find it just by chance, but I don't even tell you what the rules of the competition are, so you're really poorly prepared. And then of course I win and I get the cake, and I say, no, look, it's a fair competition. We were both here, we both competed, and I got the cake. That strikes many people as rightfully so deeply unfair. You think, in order for, say, how we allocate jobs or places at a university to be fair, individuals need to be in a good position to say, okay, I want to become a doctor. What do I need to do? What steps do I need to take in order to achieve this goal? Or I want to be at this university. What steps do I need to take in order to achieve this goal? And if we're using AI systems that make that sort of conforming your behavior in order to get the outcome you want impossible, then this is another deep source of objection. Yeah.
Let's start to think about solutions, because we've had a lot of pessimistic examples so far. There are a lot of problems in this area, but you've suggested some lines that we can take to try and ameliorate or even solve these problems. So, for example, could you give us a couple of examples of solutions?
Yeah, happily. And I think the solutions are interesting because I think they might be surprising in important ways. So, okay, if you think about the initial example of the trial and you think, okay, what would have solved this? Maybe you think, okay, well, Joseph K. and all of his fellow citizens ought to be given complete descriptions of the rules of this massive, judicial system and other bureaucratic system that they live under. They ought to be given in-depth reasons for all of the particular decisions about them. And then they need to use those in order to do things like contest a particular decision in order to say, hey, the rules we live on under are unfair, let me run out, and protest in order to conform their behavior to the rules to get some outcome, like you brought up. And I think, that is not going to work for a few reasons. One, it's just too demanding on citizens. So if you thought about, what if you and I really needed to, for all of the various AI systems that had some kind of decision-making influence over our lives, know how they worked, have, kind of use the explanations also of how they were being used in our particular case to do all of these things. I barely have enough hours in the day in order to call all of my friends, prepare my teaching and manage to eat something, much less kind of use all of these explanations that I have in order to protest. So I think for that reason, as well as a kind of another important reason, namely that requiring decision makers to explain themselves in these particular cases often just doesn't work. So think about, problems of discrimination. So we know that in order to combat discrimination, you can't just force decision makers to articulate some kind of reasons for these decisions because people lie, right? People in power can always make up some sort of rationale for why they acted as they did, even if they were acting unfairly. All right, so what do we do? So I come up with two proposals. One proposal is algorithmic impact statements. The idea is when some governmental agency, or in some cases even a private company, goes to use some algorithm to make important decisions about people's lives, distribute, access to loans or places at a university, or make decisions about child welfare, there needs to be some, public society-wide justification of the use of the algorithm that says things like, okay, we've run some tests, here are the expected impacts here are the kind of costs, here's why we think it will increase, welfare overall, here are the kind of value trade-offs that we had to make, so on and so forth. So that once people have that impact statement, then we can have a public debate about, okay, is this actually a good algorithm to be using in these circumstances? And then that, importantly, ought to be paired with some access to free experts and advocates. So if you think about the criminal justice system, we don't require individuals to go to a trial and represent themselves. Why don't we require individuals to represent themselves at a trial and criminal trials? Why do we give them free access to lawyers? Well, because individuals just don't have the expertise to do a good job in this case. So the kind of requisite social knowledge is housed in the mind of this expert who then can act on other people's behalf. And I think something like this is also what you are going to need in the case of algorithms. So say that you are part of a workplace, and the workplace uses algorithms for a number of things, but say it uses algorithms to schedule worker shifts, to inform, say, hiring and firing decisions. You should have access to someone in your workplace that you can go to and say, hey, I don't know how this algorithm chooses the shifts, but here are the kind of impacts it's having on my life. It makes it difficult for me to pick up my kids regularly. I'm losing sleep, all these sort of things. Or, hey, I've been fired and I want to register a complaint or something. And then this free expert can keep track of all of these decisions that are being made and act on your behalf potentially as an advocate to say, I've noticed this particular pattern of decisions, and maybe it looks discriminatory, maybe it just comes at a huge cost to workers' welfare or looks unfair. So I as the advocate will go through this complaint process for you.
So this would be like a member of the HR department in a company, for example, but somebody who has an understanding both of the legal aspects and of the technical aspects. Is that the idea? Would it be like going to the Genius Bar in the Apple Store?
Yeah. It's like going to the Genius Bar at the Apple Store if the people at the Apple Store were also kind of responsible for not only kind of fixing things for you and telling you what to do, but also potentially really advocating for your interests. So, the people at the Genius Bar, they've got a certain expertise. You pay them, so they sort of like hand over that expertise to you, but they don't have any kind of deep obligations to advocate on behalf of you and your particular interests. And I think in some cases, it may be that, all that's required of decision makers is just there's some access to the sort of Genius Bar, but in other kind of high stakes cases, like in the criminal justice case or in the welfare system where people have caseworkers who really advocate for their particular interest, we might think we need to add this component to the person who works at the Genius Bar. But yeah, something like that.
Okay, and just finally, just to go back to the first of the two solutions that you proposed, the algorithmic impact statements, the idea is that these would be somewhat more readable than terms and conditions, but also that they would be discussable in society. They're not just something that's given to an individual. They're something that everybody has a chance to convene over first before the algorithm is implemented. Yeah,
exactly. So here I take inspiration from a notice and comment procedure that happens in U.S. administrative law. So in U.S. administrative law, it recognizes that often administrative agencies not only enact policies, but they actually make policies because they make certain choices that affect the interests of individuals in setting out a policy. So often when these agencies will go to change or enact a new rule, they will seek comment from the wider public about whether this rule is a good one, how it affects their interests, and so on and so forth. So in order to set up the public, in order to do that well, these agencies will issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, where they'll explain not only what the new rule is in relatively simple terms, but also why it's a good one, what alternatives they considered, and some other things. And so the idea of this is that this puts individuals in a good deliberative position to think through, okay, well, do I actually agree with the reasons that this agency has offered, or do I disagree with them? Or, okay, they said that this rule would, impact this group favorably, but what about this group that I'm a member of? And so on and so forth. But, your question brings out an important criticism, which is, haven't I just pushed the problem back? Okay, these companies might have to issue these, algorithmic impact statements. Who's going to read them? Well, maybe the people with a lot of time and a lot of interest. Maybe people will hire lawyers or other experts to go through and read them. But what about, your everyday person who just doesn't have time for these kind of things? And so it might be that actually these two rights protections are most powerful when paired together. So you might have this requirement to issue these algorithmic impact statements in order for them not to just be like the terms of conditions that people click through and consent through in order to kind of enter this institutional process. There might have to be a kind of free expert or advocate whose job it is to keep track of these algorithmic impact statements, check their veracity, survey individuals and see, okay, does this actually line up with your interests, and then make a challenge on that basis.
Well, on that hopeful note, we're just about out of time. Kate Vredenburgh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.